Welcome to Rooted and Ready, the podcast from Annie's Project, where we explore the risk, resilience, and real world decisions shaping agriculture. I'm your host, Karisha Devlin. I'm a farmer and training and curriculum officer with Annie's Project. When we think about risk management, we often think about markets, finances, or production decisions. But Mother Nature has a way of reminding us that some of the biggest risks are completely outside our control. Whether you raise a few horses, a backyard flock, or a large commercial livestock operation, having a disaster plan isn't about expecting the worst. It's about being ready if it happens. Today's guest is Katie Ockert. She's a community, food, and environment educator with Michigan State University Extension. Katie is passionate about agricultural preparedness and resilience. She joins us to talk through some practical steps that producers can take today that would make all the difference tomorrow. Katie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It seems like every time we turn on the news, we see a natural disaster. Particularly here lately. There's been fires out west, there's the fires in Canada. Here in my state of Missouri, we've had some flash flooding in the southern part of the state. I've had some friends that had livestock that were swept away during just that catastrophic flooding. So, are severe weather events becoming more frequent, or is it just something that is showing up on our news?
That is a great question. So I had to go back and look at some data because I feel like we've had I'm based in Michigan, and I feel like we have seen more tornadic activity, more wildfires than I feel like I have ever seen in like the last 2 years. So I went to the NOAA website, and when you look longitudinally at the long-term data, we're really not off that much, but 2025 and 2026 have been outlier years with more severe weather in Michigan at least. So I think anecdotally we can say, yeah, we are seeing more natural disasters now than maybe we did in the 80s or 90s. So the other facet of that is that we see it more because we're more connected through social
Mhm.
media, through national news networks. So we hear about it more. And that I think just brings it closer to our minds and causes us to have to think about it a little bit more.
As farmers and ranchers, most of us insure our equipment and our crops, but emergency planning is something that often gets overlooked until we need it. Why do producers sometimes put off emergency planning?
I think it's human nature. We don't really want to think about what if a tornado hits my dairy facility?
Hmm.
What if there's a flash flood? We just, it's like drinking from a fire hose because what do you do? How do you do it? Like, it's so mind-boggling, that you just really can't even wrap your mind around it.
Hmm.
But that's where my passion comes in, that you can't be prepared for every single threat that is going to potentially happen, but you can lay some foundational groundwork so that when those things happen, you are that much more prepared to act. And I'm glad that you mentioned insurance because that is one of the mitigation techniques that we can use to
Hmm.
help us bounce back from any of those catastrophic events. And it's so important to every year sit down with your insurance agent, review your farm policies, make
Hmm.
sure that you have, if you have high dollar animals and livestock now, they are high dollar. So, making sure that you have the financial protections in place that if something were to happen, that you would be prepared on that end.
Hmm. Great point. So let's talk through some steps
Mhm.
that our listeners can take. If someone listening has never created a disaster plan, where should they begin? So you mentioned insurance, but what other things do they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think that the first and most important thing is to evaluate your area. Like Michigan, we are incredibly lucky to be very low on the natural disaster threat. threshold. We don't have hurricanes. We don't have
Hmm.
tsunamis. We don't have a lot of those activities. We're looking at ice storms, winter weather, um, tornadoes, and flash flooding, and we've had some fires in the UP. So our threat level is lowered. So really sitting down and thinking about, okay, what are the threats that I'm actually possibly going to encounter? And once you know what those threats are, then you can start to say, okay, what do I need? And divide by threat. What do I need to do, or what do I need to be prepared for if there's a flash flood or if
Hmm.
there's a winter weather? And you can start to just build little plans, because you'll never be able to be fully prepared. You've got to have just kind of that skeleton of, I've got a secondary location that I can haul my animals out to.
Hmm.
Um, I have permanent identification and I have all of those records. There's some things that you can do. I have a storage place for 5 to 7 days worth of feed and water if I need it, if I'm stuck at home with no electricity. There's just some really basic things that people can do, and it's easy.
We're going to walk through each of those things that you just mentioned. Why is permanent identification so important?
Permanent identification is probably one of the key aspects in preparedness, because if you do find yourself in a scenario where your animals are loose, whether that's you had to open gates or, like you said, animals were kind of swept away, whether they are alive or dead, those are your animals and your property. So
Hmm.
you need to be able to identify the animal, but then you also need to verify ownership. So that's where those paper records come into play, so that when those animals are found, you can then lay claim to those because you've
Hmm.
got matching ear tag numbers, or um, you've got RFID tags or Coggins papers, or some kind of documentation that that
Hmm.
is indeed your animal.
If you're gathering emergency supplies, what would you put in a livestock emergency kit?
So the first thing that I would do is just make sure that everything has identification. The next thing, I would make sure that I've got at least 3 to 7 days worth of feed and water,
Hmm.
or access to clean water. Um, that the clean water aspect gets to be kind of dicey depending on the threat that you're looking
Hmm.
at. Um, Basic medical supplies. So, do I have vet wrap? Do I have a thermometer? Do I have a stethoscope? Some of those basic wound care, first aid triage items in a first aid kit. Um, those paper records for to verify ownership. Those are all things that I would have at all times ready to go.
When it comes to different disasters, those are going to require different plans. So let's talk through some different scenarios. Flooding. I mentioned we had some catastrophic flooding in southern Missouri. What should producers know before those waters start rising?
Yeah, so the first thing, people need to assess their flood risk. Are they someplace that could potentially get flooded where they would have to think about that? Um, the first, if there's any warning that there's going to be a flood, like, a dam failed further up the river or whatever, and could cause some flooding, identifying a secondary location that you can take your animals to. That is the best case scenario. So, that involves some relational aspects where you can talk to another producer. You could utilize maybe like your local fairgrounds, a local sale barn, some place where you can take your animals so that they can get out of that path of the potential
Hmm.
flooding. If it is a flash flood situation where you're completely blindsided, the best thing to do, animals have an innate ability to, they have senses that we don't use. They can sense those things and they will move to higher ground. So you got to allow them, whether that's opening gates,
Okay.
letting them naturally move to higher ground, because you animals will protect themselves naturally. They've got thousands of years of instincts that kick in, and they can sense those things before we can. So allowing them to do their thing when you don't have any warning, that's the best thing to
Any other
do.
option.
Yep.
It is fascinating, that ability. It reminds me, I can't even remember, it's quite a while back now, maybe 15 years ago, maybe longer, that bad tsunami that happened. It was like on, I think it was around Christmas time. And anyway, one of the things I remember from some of the stories was like animals they just started moving to
Mhm.
higher ground, like they sensed it coming. And I think it almost goes against our instincts to just open up gates and stuff. But you're right. I mean, if you have no other option, you've got to let the animals
Yeah.
take care of themselves.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Giving them an option, any option, is better than keeping them contained.
confined. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Where they have no option to protect themselves. The secondary threat for floods, if you are able to stay in place where the water doesn't get to a critical point,
Mm-hmm.
but really the water quality and what bacterias and pathogens are in that flood
Yes.
water is really a tertiary thing to kind of be
Mm-hmm.
aware of. So, if you're in a flood zone, where am I going to get clean, fresh water?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have the capability to, if I have animals who have had to wade through that water, do I
Mm-hmm.
have a way to, I don't want to say decontaminate them, but do I have a way to wash them
Mm-hmm.
so that if they are physically in that water, that we can kind of wash any pathogen that might be away?
Right.
Did the feed and water get contaminated
Mm-hmm.
from that dirty water? So those are
Mm-hmm.
those are just some things to think about. Down the line as we look at, okay, the best case scenario is that you have a day or two, or even a day,
Mm-hmm.
to move animals, to gather feed, to get someplace safe. The less desirable is that it kind of took us by surprise. But do we have an area that animals can get to higher ground?
Mm-hmm.
Can we keep feed and water on some higher ground so that it doesn't get contaminated? And then when we come back, what does that decontamination process look like?
Okay. Tornadoes is the next disaster for us to touch on.
Yeah.
Many people assume livestock should be put in a barn, and I think that goes back to our instincts, like we need a shelter, we need to take shelter. But that's not always true when it comes to animals. So should you confine animals?
So that is a hot topic when you talk to people, especially horse owners. Horse owners want to say, you know what, I've got my horse in a stall.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's safe. I can check on them. But we've got to look at some of what we know from natural disasters and how structures hold up to tornadoes, if they're a direct hit versus kind of on the edges, in the wind zones, everything like that. And we have to think about how those structures behave in those high wind and high velocity wind situations, and then decide, is it a safe place for our animals?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I have experienced. So we had a dairy farm this past spring in Michigan get a direct hit by
Mm-hmm.
a tornado. It was a small tornado. I think it was an F1. Out of their 250 or so cows, they lost three,
Mm.
which was a miracle, right?
Right.
So I would encourage any livestock owner, do what you're comfortable with. Best practice, however, is open up those gates, give those animals a fighting chance to
Mm-hmm.
survive. One of the observations that one of my colleagues made as we were helping with the response from that tornado is you never see wildlife that gets injured or killed by tornadoes. It goes back to that animal instinct.
Mm-hmm.
Animals can sense those tornadoes before people can, and they run. If we give them the chance to get out of the path and we give them the chance to get to low ground, lay down, they will take care of themselves. So it's. I know people are really torn because it would make me feel better if I knew that my animals were safe in a
Mm-hmm.
shelter and everything. But from my perspective, um, when that structure, you don't know if that structure is going to remain safe. That's where the danger
Right.
comes in.
No, you're exactly right. I'm a horse person. And when I was in college, we had a small tornado go through, and I kept my horse. I stalled it at a facility, and there was other horses there, of course, too. But the tornado went through the boarding facility, and the only horses that were hurt were the ones that were in stalls in the barn. My horse was out in the pasture when it happened, and a lot of other horses were too. And there may have been a couple that had scratches. My horse came out unscathed, thankfully, but the ones that had not, they weren't severe injuries, but the ones that were hurt the worst were the ones that were confined in stalls.
Yeah. Yeah, that wind just, if it tears that building apart, horses they can't shelter themselves. So
Right.
it's, it is hard, but it is hard. I get it. I have horses too, and it is the most nerve-wracking thing for me to go out there and decide, okay, is
Mm-hmm.
today the day that I'm going to open the gates?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you have to, and that's where preparation comes, that you have to decide, when am I going to make that decision? Under
Mm-hmm.
what circumstances is, am I going to be okay with, um, braiding an ear tag into their mane?
Mm-hmm.
One of the strategies for identification is also, water soluble or waterproof paint, and you paint
Mm.
your name and phone number. I don't recommend that unless it's a last case scenario or worst
Okay.
case scenario, just because that paint could rub off,
Mm-hmm.
uh, come off in the rain. There's lots of ways that that's not necessarily permanent.
Mm-hmm.
Braiding a tag or something into a mane or a forelock tail
Mm-hmm.
is really a more, not permanent, but a more permanent than a paint.
Right.
And when you decide that that's what you're gonna do and you're gonna open those gates, you know that those horses are gonna only go as far as they need to go from home,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't want to go far from home, right? That's their safe
Right.
place.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but you also know that there's a fighting chance that you're gonna get them back.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Our next disaster is ice storms, and those don't always get as much attention. They're very familiar to me because I am from Mississippi originally, and so we would have those occasionally. In fact, my brother just went through one, and I had some friends that farm and have livestock down there. Just this past winter, they had a really bad one that where they were out of power for like a week, and a lot of fences were down from falling trees and that sort of thing. What other challenges do ice storms create?
Yeah, so the biggest and most immediate threat during ice storms is keeping the animals from getting hypothermia.
Mm,
So especially animals that are in the South, that, we're lucky here in Michigan because our animals grow big fluffy coats.
mm-hmm,
They're used to having that insulation. But we still recommend, to prevent hypothermia, get those animals shelter,
mm-hmm,
get them inside or a place out of the wind, out of the elements, so that they can keep their body temperature where it needs to be. That's the most immediate threat. The secondary threat is, once that ice has established, um, making sure that animals can get to feed and water without slipping and sliding and potentially falling and breaking something. With ice, you think about splaying back legs and breaking hips and things like that. And those are very real threats, because they're going to walk to their drinker, they're going to walk out to the hay bunk. They're going to do all of those things once the ice storm has passed and that
mm-hmm,
ice really remains. So whether that's you break up the ice with a tractor, or out there with a shovel, just giving them a path that they can get some traction on is really critical once that ice has stopped.
mm-hmm,
Um, but then after that, then the challenge becomes if you lose power. We had an ice storm in Michigan, and we're accustomed to ice storms um, up in the northern part of the state, and they were out of power for like 20 some days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Goodness.
it was pretty catastrophic. And they got to, gosh, a couple weeks in, and they no longer had a way to get livestock water. They were
Mm,
running out of fuel. They were, for generators and things like that. So, um, they had to be really creative with, okay, how do we keep fresh water pumping?
hmm
So, that initial store of feed and water that you should have on hand for any disaster, you buy yourself 3 to 7 days, but if it extends longer than that, you've got to really think about a longer term plan.
hmm
Um, Hopefully nobody ever has to experience that. That was pretty catastrophic. And we haven't seen any, I mean, knock on wood, we haven't seen anything since. But it did happen, and it was a really good reminder of, okay, what do we do if we're longer than that
hmm
7 day time frame? How do we get that critical water to the livestock that we need? But really, with ice storms, it's the hypothermia and it's the
hmm
mobility afterwards.
One disaster that we've seen on the news quite a bit lately is wildfires. But even producers who don't live in wildfire-prone states may face grass fires that get out of hand. What makes wildfire preparations unique?
Um, I think I haven't had to deal with wildfires a lot. Um, but I think what makes them especially challenging is that they're so unpredictable. The wind shifts and the whole path that you think that the wildfire is taking um, goes completely the other way.
hmm
Um, I think the other challenge is that wildfires make evacuation really hard because of all of the things that you have to think about as you evacuate. Like,
hmm
is the bedding in your trailer combustible? Like, if an ember gets in,
hmm
is it going to catch your trailer on fire? Do you have fire extinguishers that you can use on animals? So, the different classes of fire extinguishers, you
hmm
don't want to use one, you want to have a fire extinguisher that is water-based so that if you do need to use it on or around an animal, you can do that safely without the chemical
hmm
effects of that fire extinguisher. Um, it's just I feel like a wildfire is the most unpredictable
hmm
and the one that has the most variables that you have to consider as you evacuate or as you hunker down and try to get through it.
Yeah.
So,
And that's another one where I know folks are encouraged to just open up their gates. Or even I saw on the news where livestock producers were told to cut their fences
mhm.
to just allow the animals, if they could not get them moved, to allow them the ability to move
Yeah.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing with wildfire is pre-planning and really there's the Extension Firewise program. So some of the principles from that, like making sure that you have fire breaks in your
hmm
driveways,
hmm
something that'll stop those fires from getting to your barns. There's some different plantings and landscaping things that you
hmm
can do to help slow fire, slow or stop. And I think if you are able to look at those things and design your farm or your facility around using some of those principles,
hmm
would really help. Like they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if you can go into facility design or farm design with threats in mind, um, for layout, you already have an advantage.
Sometimes disaster planning can feel overwhelming. You've shared a lot of great tips today. I know I've learned several things just from our conversation so far. How can producers make progress without trying to do everything at once?
Yeah. Yeah, it is like drinking from a fire hose.
hmm
I think that the first thing and the most positive thing is just sitting down and thinking about it. Like,
hmm
what would I do? Because when you have an idea of, okay, if I know that there's a wildfire coming through and it's coming from this direction, I can load up in this amount of time and get away in this
Mm-hmm.
amount of time. Like just starting to think through what would that look like? Um, and then starting to put some of those practical pieces in place. Do I have insurance? Are my animals insured?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have a place where I can keep um, feed and water if I know that these things are coming? Like what water storage units or containers do I have? So just starting to think about, and maybe you buy a big barrel and you say, okay, this is going to be my emergency water.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just starting those first few steps and not overthinking it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do I need to, what would I like for myself? And and then deciding, okay, what would I like for my livestock to have? The one thing that I have not mentioned in all of this, that I think that we do need to talk about is first and foremost, people need to keep themselves safe.
Mm.
I mean, human safety
Yes.
is always the number one priority.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can do what we can for our animals in those disaster situations, but we need to make sure that we're taken care of first.
If there's one message you hope listeners remember after today's conversation, what would it be?
It would definitely be an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to have every detail figured out. Um, but having a general plan of, okay, if a flood is expected, I know that I'm going to evacuate my livestock. Just having an idea of what you're going to do in general and
Mm-hmm.
remaining flexible and taking in all the information that you can while you're in um, that response phase, and making the best decisions that you know how to make while you're responding. And unfortunately, experience is the best teacher.
Mm.
So once you go through um, a natural disaster of some sort, that will help inform you that, hey, this worked, but I really needed these things in place
Mm.
too. And that's another way that people can build that response plan
Mm-hmm.
so that they're even more prepared for next time.
Well, Katie, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, all the great tips that you've shared with us. I know it's left our listeners with a lot to think about and to ponder and hopefully to plan for. One of my biggest takeaways is that disaster preparedness doesn't have to happen all at once. Every small step from updating your animal identification to keeping emergency supplies organized makes your farm more resilient. Preparedness isn't about living in fear. It's about giving yourself the best chance to protect your family, your animals, and your livelihood when the unexpected happens. Thank you everyone for joining us, and until next time, stay rooted and ready.